I know.
Hey, Charlie? Well, Susan Keller, it's around here somewhere. You have to switch across the- Figure it out. How's it going? Good. How you doing?
Hello, everybody.
Yeah, 'cause I wanted to share. I guess these are up. Yeah, it's fine. I'm telling them that we found.
You sure? All right. I think we're okay.
Welcome. I guess I can give some opening remarks. Not sure how formal we have to be for a work session, but
You have to call us in the morning.
well, yeah, I can definitely do that. That's easy. I'll call us into order at this time, which is 4:03.
Would you like me to take roll?
Oh, sure. Yes, Madam Clerk.
Okay. Mr. Bivens,
Here.
Mr. Carazana,
Here.
Mr. Claiborne,
Here.
Mr. Missile,
Here.
Mr. Murray.
Here.
Thank you.
Chair,
All right.
Chair, you should know if you've not been in this room before, that the microphones in here are very sensitive.
Okay.
So I will just share that with you, Mr. Chair.
I'll take that as wisdom. I certainly will. Well, Mr. Fritz, it looks like you are here to lead us off.
I'm going to start you off and then immediately get out of the way.
All right.
Albemarle County, the Board of Supervisors has funded a study consultant to help us develop regulations for commercial solar. We have engaged the Berkeley Group, and we're working with Mike Zener, who is the author of the document you were sent earlier. And he's going to lead you in the presentation. We have some questions at the end of the presentation. We're not going to go through all of them, some key ones. And if you have comments later on, thoughts, send them to us. This is a work session. We're going to be coming back to you at a later date for a public hearing. So feel free to email us if you have any observations or comments. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Mike.
Thank you all. Again, my name is Michael Zahner. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development with the Berkeley Group, and I can't take all of the blame for the memo, so my staff helped with that as well. They couldn't be here today. I was going to have an environmental planner with us as well. Unfortunately, COVID again. So, hopefully, we'll go through this presentation. Questions and plenty of discussion today. I think maybe will be about 30 minutes, I hope, for the presentation. And yeah, we'll see where it goes, and certainly opportunity for follow-up after the meeting, through emails and communication through Bill to us. So, but as you know, as Bill indicated, there's a growing interest in the development of solar facilities within the county. And we've been engaged to assist the county in developing a better understanding of the land use issues particular to solar energy, and how those issues may be better addressed through regulations, permit review, and procedures. And so today I'm going to go over a presentation on land use regulations for solar generation facilities, with a focus on the county's current approach and thoughts that this commission and the county may wish to consider. We'll have time for discussion and questions at the end, but please feel free to jump in at any time and stop me. And looks like this is a good venue for that, so please do so. And again, the memo that we provided you dated February 20th, generally the presentation will track with that memo. There may be some items that we touch on maybe more in depth here versus in the memo, and vice versa. So if there's anything that you feel strongly about, have questions about, don't hesitate to jump in and ask. And some of the presentation will include a lot of background information that many of you may already be aware of given your experiences and other research that you've done. But as a public process, we want to make sure the presentation is as comprehensive for everyone that may be in attendance and watching. So, and make sure I don't get crossed up on computers that I'm looking at. So just an overview of the session. We'll talk about the Berkeley Group, and I think you all are familiar with us given your past experience, but I'll talk more so about our role with solar. We'll give you a general overview of national and state context, also touch on the county's experiences, and we'll discuss regulatory considerations and potential impacts really the issues that we think are at the forefront, should be at the forefront of your mind when you're thinking about solar regulation. And then we'll touch on the county's existing regulations and then discuss regulatory best practices. And then at the end, hopefully we have a really good discussion and you can give us some input and feedback. So the goals for the session, again, we're hoping, or we understand you're seeking a better understanding of the issues particular to solar energy. Yes,
Really easy favor. Could you move the picture of the people off to the works?
I might be able to do that. Let's see.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, there we go. So the goals of this: identify aspects of solar facility development or regulatory topics where the commission needs additional information. Understand commission perspectives with regard to principal opportunities or areas of concern, potentially resulting from the development of solar, and then seek input from you all on potential regulatory provisions. And we provided a list of 12 questions. Those are really a list of questions that have generated from our work, our similar work with localities. I would tell you, we don't have to answer any of them specifically, but we hope that they're a good resource to prompt discussion. Some of them may be paramount to you. They may be of critical importance to your consideration. Other ones, such as, what zoning district, those may be answered and we can dispense with those. But so really that's what we would hope you would get out of those questions. So a little bit about us, and you all know a lot about us, I think, but again, I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development, and our team working on this, 2 environmental planners, Lindsay Edwards and Luke Peters, and then our intern, Nadia Siaza. Darren Coffey, our principal, has also assisted with this in meeting with Bill, discussing it with Bill and staff, and also helping us prepare materials for you all. So I think, again, you all know a lot about us, maybe less so about our solar work, but really this started when Darren was working with Mecklenburg County some years ago, and the result of that, the experience of that, was his development of an American Planning Association, what they call Planning Advisory Services memo on planning for utility scale solar facilities. And out of that, and also working with a number of clients coming out of that, local governments, he also and myself, there was a joint solar at scale guide recently developed in the last few years by APA and ICMA. That was through a US Department of Energy grant. And Darren served on as a peer reviewer of that material, and he and I have both served as presenters for that, of certain modules for that, education webinars. So all of that, I'm not sure the total number of localities that we worked with on solar, developing policies, developing regulations, but also peer review, third-party reviewer of projects. I can tell you today, in addition to Albemarle County, we work with 8 localities, 7 in Virginia and 1 in Colorado. And I was talking earlier, one of those localities, we are working on both solar and wind as well. And we also are working to review a wind project in Virginia. So a lot of experience on the renewable side, and hopefully that translates to what we're going to talk about. So with that, as I think you all recognize, when we're discussing utility scale solar, we're generally talking about a facility that is intended for commercial production of electricity, for distribution to the electrical grid. And generally, we define these as medium scale and large scale. Medium scale, 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts, and large scale, 5 megawatts and greater. And for a good rule of thumb, and this does vary in practice, but a good rule of thumb is that it requires 10 acres of land for 1 megawatts of generation capacity. Some will cite research that looks at a lower number, 6 to 7 acres of land, but usually the higher the number, or usually the more variation in topography, the higher the number is going to be. Just as you can imagine, due to the sheer land development needs and impacts. While not a focus of this, accessory solar. So integrated into a residence, net metered, integrated into business. That's not a focus of what we're talking about here, but it's important that what we're doing doesn't preclude those options, presuming that's something that the county wishes to encourage. So what are solar facility components? Of course, you have the panels themselves and the racking. And generally, we're talking about ground mounted again. Some of these racking systems, they do auto tilt to get the best solar, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but to capture the best sunlight on the panels. We have inverters that convert DC to AC. And then you have the substation and switchyard and generator lead or gen tie lines that interconnect to the grid transmission lines. And what we're also seeing more and more of are battery energy storage developed in conjunction with solar to really store that produced power and release it into the grid at the best available time. And that's becoming, again, more and more common. And of course, fencing for security and safety, not just around substations, but also around the panels and those installations themselves.
So is there a building associated with any of that?
Sometimes there's a maintenance building. Sometimes battery storage is housed in what could be a building. A lot of the time, battery storage is housed in trailers, what look like trailers, prefab trailers. So, but most often there's really no buildings beyond a basic maintenance shed of something of that type. So with that kind of context of what we're talking about, national context, nationwide, we're seeing a large growth in renewables and especially solar, and solar is the fastest growing energy source in the world. And since 2010, the United States has seen a dramatic increase, going from 2 gigawatts in 2010 to approximately 130 gigawatts of installed solar at the end of the first half of 2022. And to help with the math, 1 gigawatt equals 1,000 megawatts. So the increase of solar is due to several factors: decrease in cost of equipment, dramatic decrease since 2010, about an 80% decrease in cost. There's a growing demand for renewably generated energy from the private sector, a lot of Fortune 500 companies and the like. Instability in the availability and costs of fossil fuels due to geopolitical conditions, state policies and incentives, and this is especially true in Virginia, and economic and financial opportunity for landowners, especially farmers and communities in general. So the context within the state of Virginia, similar to the growth nationally, solar has grown in Virginia in the last decade, with an installed solar capacity increasing from 17 megawatts in 2014 to 3,845 megawatts in 2022. And Virginia is popular for solar from a geographic and climate perspective, but also from a policy and regulatory perspective. In 2018, the state's energy plan called for targets of 3,000 megawatts of solar and onshore wind capacity to be deployed by 2022 and 5,500 megawatts by 2028. And in 2020, the Clean Energy Act was adopted, requiring Dominion Energy and American Electric Power, also known as Appalachian Power, to the state's two principal utilities to produce 100% of their electricity from renewable sources by 2045 and 2050 respectively. And the two images here are from a Virginia solar survey done by Virginia Department of Energy and UVA. The image at the top shows the location of active facilities of 5 megawatts and greater located throughout the state as of December 2021, as well as the table on the bottom shows the annual growth in generation capacity since 2015, which the numbers I referenced earlier and referenced on the slide has been a huge increase since 2014. So, yes.
That's a quick question.
Sure.
The number of energy providers, is it roughly the same increase in percentage, or I would assume some of the established groups are just growing?
So when you mean energy providers, Dominion, Appalachia, or developers of solar?
Of solar, yeah, like Hexagon, et cetera.
There's a lot of consistent developers within the state. I mean, but we do see newer and newer, and we do see out of state and national entities coming in as well.
Got it.
There's a few that are based here in Charlottesville.
Right.
That we see that are quite active, but yeah, I would tell you, yes, it is probably is growing. I don't know that we've tracked that, but yeah, I
Curious
have to
how that
imagine.
compares to the actual growth of solar in general. I would assume
Yeah,
it's
it would
not
be
quite-
interesting. Yeah.
I have one other question
Sure,
in terms of like rules
please.
of thumb, just to help us get our arms around the numbers and the metrics you're using.
Yep.
Is there like a rule of thumb for like how many megawatts can do how many homes, like 5 megawatts? can
Yeah,
do X amount of
that I
homes?
don't have off the top of my head.
Okay.
But I'm trying to think if we have a slide in here, but if you give me a second while we're talking,
Sure.
I can give you that benchmark. So let's see. So the experience with the county, it's my understanding there's been 3 projects permitted so far, 1 pending review. And certainly there may be others that are lining up. And I would tell you this, most often what we see is that the locality is usually the last to know about a potential project. Usually these companies are working with landowners, lining up lease agreements. And then all of a sudden there's a project that's before you of hundreds or thousands of acres, and that's fairly common. Not necessarily ideal for how we manage things at the local level, but it is generally how the business is engaged, so.
Before you move on, this is for Kevin or Andy. We were doing we saw a couple of years ago a project on Jefferson Parkway. And I had noted a question, did that ever move forward?
That's the Ravenna Solar Project that's
That's
listed
the
up
Rav-
there,
oh,
and
okay.
it's under site plan review right now.
Okay, so that's
So
okay.
it's in final stages for construction.
And so it's that one, and it's the one at the landfill, and then the one that's over in Batesville,
And then the one pending.
and the one that's pending that we just saw. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and to your question earlier, in addition to, and this kind of is highlighted here, in addition to solar developers, you also have the utilities that also, involve themselves, dabble in it. Whether they're the principal contractor or they're subbing, or they're otherwise representing, or represented by a developer. Most often, the sizable utility scale projects, they eventually, and I don't know that this is 100% accurate, true, but many of those projects are sold to Dominion. And, we don't see, at least from our role, we don't see a lot of co-op scale projects. The co-ops are not subject to the same 100% renewable transition that Dominion and Appalachian or AEP are. So that, I believe, has some effect on it. And I think the co-ops are a little, they lag behind, I would say, a little bit in that transition, but we are seeing it more.
I was gonna mention too, to Chair Claiborne's question about the scale, I know someone in here is gonna know the answer. I think Hexagon was provided something like 25% of the county's total needs. So
Well,
138 megawatts. I was like,
And it's an interesting point that you bring up, because for the most part, all of the energy generated by utility scale is going into the transmission line infrastructure. So it's technically impossible to say it's being utilized locally.
Sure, yeah.
There is some physics involved with that, I would say, and that I think you could equate it to being used locally, but you can't really confirm that. So, whereas co-ops, oftentimes they are able to say that the energy that they're producing locally is staying locally. And there's some, and that's not necessarily true in every case, but more so than utility scale that's going into the transmission infrastructure. So,
Real quickly, the matrix that we're looking at there, so pretty much every single one of those is averaging more than 10 acres per megawatt. So just wondering, is that more the case in Albemarle County because of the topography here?
probably, yeah, and we haven't dove into the details of any one of these projects, but I can tell you that the majority of the localities that we work with, it's hilly terrain, but it's not as variable as it is in Albemarle County. So it's quite possible that you're seeing a higher average than we would normally expect.
The hexagon is well,
Mhm.
that's probably like
Yeah.
15, 17 or 18.
Yeah, it would be interesting to look at that one and really the reason why. And some of it depends on how you're qualifying the project area versus the fenced area
Right.
and how you're
This
equating.
fence area was much smaller than that.
Right.
And there was also,
Buffer.
if we'll remember that there was a relationship or a knowledge between the principals, which I think is different for the Hexagon project. That's different from some of the other ones.
Well, and also when you get into things like agrovoltaics, where someone may be leasing a portion of a larger farm property, do you look at the leased area? Do you look at the fenced area? Do you look at the size of the lot? So it's a rule of thumb, but it's not a rule. And you know, a lot of variation. You know, you could have a site, and maybe this is the case with the Hexagon site, where you have open space that allows for solar development, but you also have significant wetlands or topography that make it more challenging, and that area wouldn't be developed anyway. But it's, you know, part of the project site.
They had significant stream buffers. They also had buffers around the edge of the site to screen it.
Right.
And then in addition to that, they also provided adequate space for stormwater ponds
Right.
and space to get in and maintain them.
Good.
So
Yeah,
they said that they claimed that that was different than a lot of folks who throw all these panels out on the site plan and don't sketch in those other things that they need.
Yeah, and that's certainly part of the process that we would recommend, that some of these application components, that they address things like that in their application. So again, we believe that solar is a utility scale. It's an intensive land use. It's a unique land use. And you know, ideally, these are located on former industrial land or brownfields, but more often than not, due to land demands and availability and costs, they're located on undeveloped land, agricultural or forested land, or previously timbered land is what we commonly see. Because of their uniqueness, because of their intensity and development, we do believe they require unique regulatory considerations based on identified best practices and the specific goals and areas of concerns of the county. So kind of to jump in terms of the land use impact. So obviously a change in land use where you have a formerly rural area or parcel that may have been actively under agricultural use or forested or timbered. That's commonly what we're seeing, and in some cases, depending on the community, there could be competing, that land use could be competing for residential development, for industrial development. But again, there's also financial considerations at play, and usually we're seeing that lands dedicated to this use have less development potential for other uses. That solar is the highest and best use, but that also presumes that there's a lower value per acre involved. So some of the impacts: infrastructure impacts, environmental impacts, visual concerns, impacts to roadways and traffic safety during construction. A lot of the projects that we've reviewed, not all of them, but a lot of them in rural areas, smaller roads that are barely 2 lanes. You know, some projects, a significant number of curb cuts for construction. You have delivery of materials. You have large trucks traveling these roads. It's important consideration. Reduction of wildlife mobility due to fencing of pods of panels. Alteration of existing topography through grading. Impacts to soil conditions due to removal of topsoil and compaction during development. Erosion and sedimentation as a stormwater runoff issues during the development phases, as well as when the facility is in full operation. And then removal of existing forested areas, and then impacts to agricultural soils. Again, compaction, but also potentially zinc leaching, which can affect some crops in the future. Visual impacts are also a point of concern. You know, preserving the rural character of an area, scenic view sheds principally. Those are a lot of the concerns that people share. And agricultural impacts, again, soil compaction, removal of topsoil, the fact that this use is going to occupy a large land area for 30, 40 years, that it may impact the ability to use that property for agricultural purposes after the fact, due to primarily to soil impacts. And then alteration of site topography that may impact stormwater flow and water infiltration. Another consideration is that there's an potential option for agrivoltaics, which is the combination, the integration of solar generation with agricultural uses. And we do see that in a lot of localities. They don't necessarily specifically call it that. But in a lot of cases, what we see is someone wants to lease a portion of their farmland to be developed for solar. It just so happens that they're going to actively farm the remaining portion as they have for years. Yes.
So one potential conflict that I see with the inclusion of agriculture is that we have a lot of exclusions. Typically for agriculture, for example, we don't require stream buffers for agriculture. We exempt them from a lot of our regulations. So when you layer those two uses on top of one another, agriculture and an industrial use, that I think it really needs to be settled. Which is the primary use and which one is going to govern what you're going to require in terms of buffers and water protection. Because if it's going to remove the buffer requirements, then it may be better to do without the agriculture.
Yeah.
Maybe just add a buffer requirement for solar
Is that
sites.
a buffer requirement?
Good.
Yeah.
That's why we're here. Not to do that particular thing, but talk about what types of things we should consider for an ordinance.
Yeah, I think, it's good to answer the question, because a lot of localities, and I'm not certain about this for Albemarle County, their ordinances are set up where you have one principal use per piece of property.
Right.
And you couldn't have accessory uses, but really here you're allowing for two principal uses, and how do you manage that?
We
And
can split zone it.
Yeah.
You can split zone it.
Well, very few are allowing for two principal uses. I mean, most of the time, this becomes industrial. I mean, most of these are purely industrial. You can't really have much agriculture there
in terms of the use or the zoning?
in terms of the use,
Right, we let them by special use permit, but we
Right.
haven't changed the zoning to industrial.
correct?
Most communities
Which is a,
are not changing zoning
Right.
when solar projects come through. They're usually allowed in industrial, but we don't see a lot of projects in industrial zone property. Most often it's rural, residential, or agricultural zoning that you're gonna see this in, and communities kind of acknowledge that in their policies, where this is viewed as more of an industrial use. But yet, because of the land demands and frankly, the reality, it's going to be located in a larger lot zoning district, like ag or rural residential.
I've noted the comment, we can address that, and just there's a way to do it through conditions and performance standards. We can
So the other thing is too, is I wonder, I was shocked to see a big solar project going in Chesterfield that was going to destroy a site that was well known to natural heritage. There was a state endangered site with a long list of state imperiled and threatened species.
Yep.
And so what are you seeing in terms of people? I mean, DCR has a nice database out there that has a list of all their state rare species. What are you seeing in terms of localities actually using that data in terms of preventing that sort of thing that we saw at Chesterfield?
So I can only speak for our advisement of our clients, and I can tell you that we look at that database and several others, but we look at that database when we're reviewing a project and developing a staff report or developing recommendations for a locality. Ultimately, whether that bubbles up as a primary concern for the elected body, the planning commission, it's really, up to the individual locality, but we do reference it. I would tell you, and I've not seen this, but it's quite possible that you could potentially institute that as a finding for a permit where, and we'll talk about that a little bit with respect to some of the recommendations, but you know, you could have a situation where you don't have a subjective regulation, but more objective findings and something like that. Is it, you know, are there endangered species listed, or is it a valued, you know, natural resource, and based on the you know, certain guidance, and have that be a qualification or a consideration for a permit. So there's a way to institute that. And most recently, I saw that from a locality with respect to prime ag soils, in terms of, they actually set as a finding for prime ag soils that if a site had less than 10% of prime ag soils, it could be, the limitation on development of that could be waived through the conditional use or special use permit process. Whereas if it had more than 10%, it essentially mandated through a finding that land, that percent above 10% had to be excluded from the project. Apologies. Stormwater management. This is a principal concern during development, but again, during operations. You can probably Google this with respect to solar facilities in the state, and probably find news articles with concerns about projects that have occurred throughout the state. Panels create a semi-permeable cover. Soil compaction creates infiltration coefficients similar to concrete. Stormwater and sediment basins, they are instituted in most projects that we see, but they need to be well planned. We encourage the retention of existing vegetation, enhancing setbacks from wetlands, restricting total development until a site is, or soil is stabilized. And in some cases, what we see and suggest are limits on developing more than 100 acres or 500 acres at a time before stabilization. And also a best practice is native and pollinator friendly plantings, avoiding invasive species, and really requiring and focus on the plantings that are occurring in these projects.
Ask you a quick question about that.
Yeah.
So when Hexagon, when we reviewed the Woodridge Solar, we talked a bit about a maintenance plan for, are you going to talk to some of that? I'm just curious
Yeah,
what it's
that's
gonna be.
included as part of our best practice regulations.
Great,
So
thanks.
absolutely. Let's see. So decommissioning is also important. The state code mandates that whether it's in your regulations or in your permit or in your siting agreement, that decommissioning be addressed. Really, it's to cover the cost of this decommissioning that facility at the end of its lifespan, 30, 40 years. Addressing how you're decommissioning it, the disposal impacts, how you're disposing of equipment. You know, usually what we are suggesting is that in your regulations, you spell out what's going to be required for a decommissioning plan. Cost estimates, usually what we're suggesting is that those be reevaluated every 5 years throughout the lifespan of the project, that there be a bond or other type of security put in place. So a whole laundry list of requirements for decommissioning. And then one thing that we know was important to you all is some thoughts about potential contamination. And to be clear, this is not our area of expertise. We are land use planners. We know that panels contain hazardous materials. We understand that the biggest opportunity for those materials to be instituted in the environment is when you have a damaged panel. And so there is, on the maintenance side, you know, if there's panels that are damaged, that they are not stockpiled on site, that they're removed within a timely period. Those are some of the things that we are suggesting. Also, battery energy storage systems, lithium-based batteries, concerns with fires principally. Usually we're recommending, and you know, there are concerns for explosion on these. So I don't know whether that's something that you all are interested in or not. in terms of allowing for battery energy storage systems. But we do recommend that there be frequent and ongoing training for fire and EMS personnel. Again, that's something that you can look into in terms of news articles with explosions and injured personnel and the like. So it's really making sure that we're all aware, especially fire and EMS, how to put those fires out, making sure that the system is designed well, that they have suppression incorporated in them. And there are codes addressing that. But again, it's something that kind of belt and suspenders to make sure there is not an issue. And I mentioned before, zinc is really, in terms of leaching from a constructed site, really we only understand that there's a potential for zinc leaching into the ground from steel posts. We understand that over the lifetime of a project, that the only potential impact that could possibly have is on the successful ability to grow peanuts. Beyond that, peanuts, yes.
Okay.
Beyond that, we're not aware, but that doesn't mean that there's not some research out there on this. I can tell you that one of our clients that we worked with, a locality in Kansas, did have a researcher, an academic, come to talk to them about this concern, and he expressed no concern. Is that definitive? No, and that's anecdotal from me. So if that's a point of concern, potentially we can provide and seek out some more resources on that.
Is there any greater risk with this use of steel than with a building, or?
Not any, there's a potential with this, apparently, with any zinc coated steel.
Okay. So it's not like a
it's-
heightened risk.
No.
Maybe they're more exposed to.
It's just a
Terms of
reuse.
risk.
It's a process. The leaching occurs where there's corrosion involved, and the zinc is leaching off the steel.
So I thought there was some research as well about leaching off the panels themselves and some of the chemicals that go into.
As far as we know, that has not been a point of actual concern that we are aware of. But again, it's something, if it's something that is of a concern to you, we can attempt to do additional research. We can attempt to plug in someone that may be more knowledgeable than we are on that. So I think lastly, in terms of impacts, economic impacts, administration impacts, obviously it's an income source. It's an income source in terms of tax revenue, potential payments, depending if you do a siting agreement. There's really, from a tax standpoint, you can pursue it as an M&T tax or do it as a revenue share. UVA has a handy calculator for determining which one is preferable there. There's also, again, the potential to enter into siting agreements with developers and potential additional payments involved there to offset impacts of the project. So that is a whole separate maybe discussion, but something that's important to discuss. I would also say in the administration of these, and this may or may not be more relevant to Albemarle County, but it is certainly more relevant to some of the smaller localities that we work with. We're talking about sizable development projects, and those projects can significantly impact administrative staff and operations, inspectors, et cetera. So that can present a challenge, and it's certainly something to take into account. You know, and even not just at the local level, but even at the state level too, with DEQ inspections of sites. So existing regulations for the county. Currently, you define the use solar energy systems, and you allow the use subject to a special use permit in specific zoning districts. What we recommend is that there be clearly defined regulations and standards, that those create consistency across projects, and they provide for predictability, which benefits the community, developers, and the public. So let's walk through.
Sorry, just a
Yes.
quick question. Could you remind us which of the districts solar is allowed by special use permit within? I thought it was just RA,
Is that
just rural agriculture.
so? jumping into our best practices, and most of these touch on the issues that we talked about, but really, again, defining the use. These are general and application procedures. So defining the use, determining the zoning district, establishing procedures and minimum application content. You know, we talked about some of the, like a maintenance plan, you know, at least referencing that in their application material. But usually you have your standard requirements for a conditional or special use permit application. Often we are recommending that there be specific application requirements, the decommissioning plan or a draft of the decommissioning plan, stormwater plan, a preliminary stormwater plan, grading plans, preliminary grading plans. We're going to require those or suggest that those be required as part of all applications. And then again, decisions on whether or not the county wishes to enter into and pursue siting agreements and revenue share. Let me step back. Usually we recommend 2 steps in a process. 2232 review, which is 15.2 2232 of the state code, which is determining whether or not a utility project is in accordance with the comprehensive plan for a community. Usually we recommend that that be a separate process before the planning commission, more to increase transparency around projects that can be cited. Oftentimes, and I think how you all have been proceeding, is that those reviews are really combined within the consideration of the special use permits, and that's perfectly fine too. I think there's rationale to do it either way. Again, our recommendation is that if you separate the process, it just gives the public more time to digest and understand what can be a significant project. So minimum development standards, and these are lengthy. I think they cover 2 slides, but do you wish to set, for instance, minimum and or maximum area facilities or rated capacities? Some communities will say throughout the entire county, there shall be no more than this many acres devoted to utility scale solar, or no single project can exceed this many acres or megawatts. Maximum lot site coverage and or minimum percentage of open space. Minimum distances from towns or cities. They'll create a buffer mile from towns or even communities, villages that are not incorporated. Minimum distance from other facilities, so separation between facilities. Minimum distances from identified natural, historic, cultural, or similar resources. And I would say not a lot of communities that we work with have definitive historic or cultural resources where they say, you know, this place is so important in the community and we don't want to negatively impact the aesthetics of that environment, but that's quite possibly an option. Street and property line setbacks specific to the use. And I would say in some cases, and you can look at this, you could say, here's the specific setback from a property line, from a street right of way. You could vary that. There could be scenic roads that you want to increase setback. There could be instances where you say, here's the minimum setback from a property line, but in any case, the fenced active panels need to be located a certain distance from occupied residences. So there's a lot of variability in terms of how you think about that. Maximum height. Usually what you'll see in most every ordinance that we've not been involved in is a height limit, 15 feet, 20 feet, 25 feet, what have you. What we also recommend is that there be a maximum height for the lowest edge of the panel to avoid erosion issues from stormwater sheeting off the panel. There's research that has been done that shows that if that lowest edge is any higher than 10 feet, then that could cause additional runoff and erosion. And then again, this relates a little bit to the first point, but total density of facilities either countywide or within a defined area. Some communities will say, and this goes there's a lot of, to figure out what are we defining a facility as, fenced area, project area, but some communities have a let's say a 5 acre radius, no more than 1% within that 5 acre radius can be developed for solar.
That's a good question on this. So it strikes me that these are all so site dependent, right? Not all of them, but most of them are. Do you find that localities have created things that are more guideline-like than standard requirements?
For most of these, no,
Okay,
but some of them, yes, like the distances from towns.
yeah,
There's some communities that say it's a mile, except if we get approval from the town to allow for a lesser distance.
I see.
Or they've said our maximum density within that 5 mile radius is 3%, but that can be waived by the Board of Supervisors in their
Got it.
decision. But again, with anytime you're doing that, you're reducing the predictability of the outcomes, right? So,
How about floodplains?
I mean, our basic recommendation is they not be developed, that they be avoided without a doubt.
When we were talking about this, that one there, it sort of talks about minimum distances from identified natural, historic, cultural, or similar resources. We threw in floodplains and that things and
Right.
agriforestry, and we kept getting long, and so we put some resources.
Well, and on this plan too, you can see here, this water body went through here, and I'm not certain if this is floodplain, all of it, but you can see where they didn't develop through this area, and all of these are, some type of stream or water course that feeds into that larger water body.
It looks like they put a big, I'm gonna assume they've got a big fence, that pink
Yeah,
and
that,
black dotted line, that now it's a wildlife blockage.
yes.
Except for anything that's bigger than, for, maybe to let some quail run through it. but
Well,
it's-
So this one, I'm trying to recall exactly, but this is probably fenced here. The pink is definitely not fenced, I'll tell you that.
Okay.
The fencing probably, this is a wildlife corridor, I would tell you through here. But to the earlier point, all of these stars are access points.
Okay,
So, this image up here shows you a lot without me telling you a lot about it, but, there's a lot of information up there that we've gone over. Landscape buffers and screening, landscaping and ground cover, native, non-invasive, fencing and security measures, wildlife corridors. These are, again, all things that we suggest be incorporated in some fashion within ordinances. Lighting requirements, signage requirements, noise requirements, in a lot of ways, sometimes you can refer to existing ordinances and regulations.
can I ask you a question?
Mhm.
When you're talking about the option to say like distance from a property line versus distance to the nearest dwelling, we've certainly had situations with projects where we've given an exception because even though they're moving closer to the property line, they're just moving closer to a cow.
Mm,
They're not irritating a homeowner.
mhm.
And in other cases, we look at where the nearest dwelling is. So I'm just wondering, what about the case where we say, oh, well, it's just next to a farm field, so it's, we'll waive that or we'll let it be closer, but then somebody comes and builds their dream house
Yeah.
there, now it is close to a dwelling.
Well, I mean, generally, these are not noise producing things.
Yeah,
The-
so
really,
somebody-
the biggest impact is visibility.
Right. So somebody would build their house, they'd know there was a solar
I would
farm.
hope so.
Yeah. I don't know, you would be surprised if people are
Yes,
like,
no, you're, yeah.
how dare there be a cell tower near my house? It's like it's been there for 30 years,
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah.
People do that. They clear some trees and then they see something
Sure.
they don't like.
Well,
True example.
One of the big things I've heard about at other sites, which inclines me to say we should have a buffer around the edge, is there's been cases of sediment flowing off the solar facility onto neighboring parcels. And so at least that buffer would also serve to prevent sediment flowing off that facility onto a neighboring parcel.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a value to them, not just visibility, but that impact. Addressing transmission lines and other support infrastructure, what else is going to be installed as part of this facility? Potential groundwater monitoring requirements, coordination with local emergency services, i.e., not just for access to the facility, but also in case, if there is battery storage, training associated with that. And then, oops, sorry, I wasn't reading from the right slide. And then maintenance, making sure that landscaping and buffers are maintained, making sure that installed equipment is maintained. And then I think lastly, before we kind of get to the questions and more discussion, addressing construction mitigation, phasing, timeline, staging, storage, transportation routes, et cetera, decommissioning, again, establishing as part of the community's ordinance. I would tell you for all of those things, you could address them through conditions. But again, I think what are the things that are critically important to the county that you want to establish baseline requirements for? There may be things that you want to allow some flexibility in, and how do you institute that flexibility? And then maybe the other things are not important enough or not black and white enough to come up with a regulation, but we want to make sure that they're nailed down in conditions on a project, a particular project.
I have a question related to standards, conditions, limitations, all those kinds of things. So what you're going through is mostly that, right? It's like, how do you control this? Have you found, like, if there's a county, and I would hope our county is like this, that is committed to sustainability and have, we have a climate action plan, and that's potentially hopefully going to grow and be more robust. Have you had or seen opportunities where the developers of these facilities are brought in and said, what can we do to help you?
Yeah.
And how are those, as opposed to the limitations?
Yeah, I think almost across the board, I think regardless of what you're talking about, that proactive effort, I think can lead to better outcomes, better projects. And no, I would tell you, we've not worked with a lot of localities or currently that are proceeding in that manner. It would certainly be encouraging, and I would tell you, perhaps there's conversations to be had, with Dominion or the co-ops. I think from a climate action plan standpoint, if you're really looking to reduce the local impact, then potentially the co-ops may have the best, immediate impact on that. So that could be an opportunity there. Not to say that Dominion would not be able to, but just the nature of their operation and how that generated electricity is flowing.
Yeah.
It's not generally directly beneficial, as a produced electricity. They do have some programs that's not necessarily the case, but most of the generated electricity, again, is going right into the transmission grid. So.
Got it.
Commissioner Murray, you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, are we ready for, no, maybe I'll hold until we're ready for general discussion.
So I'm at the end. Again, these next slides are the questions that we gave you. I don't have to go through these. I'm happy to go through them, but I don't have to. There were 12 questions. Some of them may be of more importance to you all than others. I'm happy to proceed however the chair would like.
So we can open the floor to general discussion.
Yeah. So one of the big challenges that I see is that currently our rural area, well, let me go back to that. When you look at our comprehensive plan and you look at the growth areas, they're this mosaic of beautiful different colors. When you look at the rural area, it's all one color. We're basically treat the RA as all the same. And I see that as a big problem with our comprehensive plan, is that we're treating the rural areas, if it is all the same, while we have done some great research on looking at areas of high ecological integrity, of large forest blocks. There are areas of prime agricultural soils, areas that we know they're in land use valuation or under ag-forestal districts. So in practice, the rural area is not all the same. And it seems to me that the best thing to do would be to actually differentiate some of those areas in our comprehensive plan. Maybe even have explicit agricultural zoning, as many localities do. And then have areas that we may even consider explicitly designating areas where solar makes sense. In addition, the climate action plan comes up a whole lot. It's worth noting that we do have a biodiversity action plan as well. And so just looking at some past correspondence from DCR, they usually require, they usually recommend a buffer of 250 meters around any special national heritage resources. So I would recommend that as a starting point, that be something that the county thinks about. It's also worth noting that that there are also locally designated special sites by the Natural Heritage Committee that looks at places, natural communities of significance to the county. And we should also consider those as we look at, these improvements. The other thing that occurs to me in terms of wetlands, there's National Wetlands Database. I hope people refer to it. Currently, the way that our water protection ordinance is structured, we don't require buffers around wetlands unless they're directly hydrologically connected to a river or stream. I would recommend that we consider including buffers around any wetland, not just those that are hydrologically connected. So those are just some starting points of discussion.
Yeah, often we do suggest a 100-foot buffer from wetlands and water bodies. Sometimes an applicant will offer that as part of their application. Other times it will be recommended as a condition by us, but that's something we agree with.
Yeah, the other thing I should mention too is the Natural Heritage Committee, which I'm also a member on. We strongly in support of the pollinator-friendly practices that I think have been that a lot of the solar industry has embraced. And the use of native plants has been mentioned.
So yeah, I'll just tag onto that. So he was referring to the biodiversity action plan. As part of that, there's a map of forest blocks. But there's basically large habitat cores that have already been evaluated for the county, looking at soil diversity, looking at prevalence of wetlands and other water features such as streams, looking at whether there's RTE species in there, and they've already been ranked. So that's something unique that, and you may be familiar with this, it's basically the Virginia Natural Landscape Assessment, the vanilla model that DCR created, and we refined it at a 1 meter scale for
vanilla,
Albemarle.
yeah.
So ours is more precise, although it hasn't been updated in several years. But nevertheless, it would actually not be that hard to update that map. But I think we need to maybe write something a little more unique than what we may be used to in terms of protecting access between those or not obliterating them. I drew a simple cartoon that shows, solar site obliterating, solar site not obliterating, ways to fit panels within, just as a cartoon for some of my solar developer friends. But I think we could actually write some pretty specific standards that would still allow for solar development, but would not allow it to ignore some of the special resources that Albemarle County has taken the time to document. I also support having a buffer from streams and wetlands as well as along the roadside. So a lot of times buffers are too narrow when they're less than 100 feet. And if you take a forest and you cut it down and you leave a thin strip of trees, the wind gets in there. And then you see everyone's complaining in Albemarle all the time about sites where trees are falling in the road. They're falling in the road now. It's because there's nothing preventing that wind that's ripping across. The other thing is steep slopes. You mentioned that in your presentation. The pictures you showed, I'm not faulting you in any way, but they were all flat sites. And we have a lesser steep slope standard for rural areas. So in terms of that question of whether it's an agricultural site or a solar site, I think it needs to be considered a solar site. I wouldn't want them to come in and then adhere to the agricultural standards for buffers, which basically non-existent.
Yeah, usually for steep slopes, it's our recommendation, whether it be part of the regulations or part of the permit conditions, that they not develop anything greater than 15%. So, and we've not heard any concern about that limitation.
In this case, where we have a critical slopes ordinance, and we have a delineated, critical slope map in the GIS, it seems we should stay out of those areas.
But we have two standards. One is managed and one's preserved.
Only in the growth area, the rural area only has one standard.
Right.
So I think the rural area standard the rural area standard is the one that I think we should go by, not the growth area
Right.
standard of managed and preserved.
And, you know, we don't have a lot of preponderance or flatland around here. Especially, anything near the development ring. You know, we have all this analysis we do about whether we have any land for industrial or heavy commercial, and we keep coming up short. And so if we were to fill like a site like that with solar panels, might be shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of other, you know, because you were talking about highest and best use.
Right.
Anyway, I don't want to dominate, so.
Yeah, I think that's always, that is a challenge too on solar on industrial land where it is not necessarily a long-term job creator either. So.
I'll just make one more quick point then. There also is a difference in what kind of land cover is being cleared, right? So you mentioned prime ag soils, can't speak today. But there's also differences in forest type.
Mhm.
So for example, I would have more heartburn about a mature hardwood forest being proposed to be cleared for solar panels than it would a pine forest where the pine rotation is about 20 years. Hardwoods are more like 100 years.
Mhm.
They have a thick duff layer and providing a lot more wildlife habitat. The reason that it was in support of that last project we had down near Scottsville, in Supervisor Price's district is because that site was actually heavily impacted. And I felt like that particular solar company, not all solar companies, but the one in question, is going to actually do more to restore the soil
Yeah.
and the habitat, and there's a lot of big erosion gullies. I mean, so the site was in bad shape. So I saw it as an improvement in that case, but in general, I know that the Virginia Department of Forestry has a lot of concerns with, you know, losing timber sites, you know, to solar. So I guess it would depend. So I feel like in the language, you should have something about hardwood, you know, the discouraging clearing of uncleared land for solar, of forests, and then with a much stricter standard or prohibition against hardwoods. And maybe that's not possible. But that's kind of a distinction I think is important to understand.
Yeah, and I think there needs to be like a buffer there too. You don't want to create a situation where someone clears the land under one guise of agriculture and then turns right back around and then puts in their solar application.
Mm.
So, you know, there has to be
Right,
like
somebody
some-
could, well, yeah, I mean, I don't know, some communities have had waiting periods. We did have a situation on the James River near where I live where somebody said they were doing forestry and they cut down trees in the buffer, big hardwood trees, left them to rot, and then applied for a campground. Though that was what I called faux forestry. It was even worse than actually, at least they, you know, doing something with the trees. This was just fake. So, anyway.
I have a couple of thoughts. So for me, there's like the macro discussion and then there's the micro discussion, right? So the macro, big picture thoughts, and I don't know, none of this will be resolved, but you know, if we have farmland in the rural area. And to the question of, do you limit the amount, scale, the size within a county? I think we have to be thinking about what are our uses and what do we want to retain in terms of things like farmland and open
Right,
space?
do you want a
Or do we wanna
7,000
just
acre
turn it
solar
over?
facility?
Yeah, or do we want to
that?
just turn it over and say, oh, it's fine, fair game, everything is.
Anywhere in the rural area, as long as you follow
Right.
these rules.
So that's one kind of the big picture. I think to echo what is also being said, just the sites, you know, in general, in terms of what is this current standard, the current status of the site, and whether or not that should be, you know, if it's already degraded, does that get a higher potential opportunity for solar? You know, how do we look at that? How do we plan to prioritize those areas that are already degraded, if there's a way to do that?
Yeah, similarly how you would prefer a brownfield site be used for
Right.
solar than.
Right. The other is one that I mentioned before when I was thinking about the climate action plan and just thinking about the county's overall goals, still thinking macro. You know, I mean, I feel like there is a goal, or there needs to be a goal that we then strive towards, right?
Yeah.
So UVA
Or like
has
for energy
goals
generation, you
for
mean?
carbon reduction versus
Right.
zero carbon, et cetera. I mean, we have to, I think if we can tie the strategy of solar and other sustainable development
Yes.
to something that is actually a goal, that'll help guide these documents as opposed to, and that to me feels like the right way to come about this, as opposed to coming end around saying, well, you can't do this, you can't do this, you need buffers, you need this. Not saying that that's wrong, think we just need to think about a goal and sustain that. The first few questions up there, talking about the zoning districts where solar should be allowed. This was a real life example that we dealt with where we had a large area of property that was zoned R1. And we wanted, it was not, and this is probably not common, but we didn't want to develop it. We don't foresee developing it in quite a while. It's an abandoned golf course area and we wanted to put solar on it, but because it's R1, we couldn't. We could only go half acre. So I think as we think about how to go about this in other areas, we should somehow think about, is there some flexibility outside of the RA district to allow, maybe not for full, large scale facilities, but I think you mentioned community solar versus utility scale, thinking about how that mix looks. And if there's a way that we can offer a benefit by creating more opportunity for community solar, if you want to call it that, in other districts. I think, for me, the expiration, the decommissioning are sort of tied together. And I know one of the applicants that came to us did not plan to hold on to the property. They were going to develop it and then they were going to flip it, right? So thinking about how we manage that, if there's a maintenance plan in place, how does it transition to a new owner? And thinking about what requirements we might have tied to that.
Yeah, I think just to build on that.
Yep.
Particularly when we get these developers that are giving us these beautiful plans, right? This is going to be planted with all kinds of beautiful tree or wildflowers for pollinators, and you're going to be able to graze on it, and all. Sounds wonderful. Well, there's grazing. There's grazing as well. So who's ensuring that that's being maintained and that that's being planted properly? And how does that transition, with the owners, the changes in owners, as Fred just mentioned? But even in the same owner, how do we ensure that that's being followed?
When was it called, Hexagon? Yeah, so
they
talked about having a third party monitor, and we recommended that.
Right.
But I would offer on that, that's no different than anything that comes before us.
Right.
So I would like to just be clear that what's going on in the solar is no different than a big project that comes to us, like say the one on Ryle Road, where they said they were going to do this, they're going to do this. And as staff has sort of gotten me better with, actually, it was our former chair got me better with, the project gets sold.
Mm-hmm.
And so the person who brings it to us is very rarely and I don't know if that just happens to be the environment we're in here, that entity is rarely the one that brings it to fruition or brings it to completion, except for a couple of big players in town. But for most of the other players, they come before us and we see wonderful things, and then the next thing I find out, it's been sold to somebody else, and
But
they're doing it.
I think that's exactly why we're bringing this up, because here we're taking what can be and is in many cases very valuable farmland or ag land,
Right, but we don't
and
know.
changing it to an industrial use.
And here's where I want to, at some point when this comes back, I'd really like to have a deep conversation about prime soils. And I would offer to this whole piece that 10% is not a threshold for me. Now, it may be a threshold for a whole host of people, but telling me something that 10% of the soil on a land is prime and therefore should fall into a particular condition is not good enough for me.
Well, that just quickly, that can easily be informed by looking at a map. We mapped
I know,
prime soil.
I saw,
We
that's
just
why I'm
pulled,
saying that.
now I'm not gonna sit here and debate whether the
Yeah.
USDA database is great
That's
or
a whole
not
different
great.
thing, that's a whole different thing.
But we have a map of where prime ag soils allegedly are located.
Right.
And so it would not be hard exercise to look at, 50% or,
Well, some
I'm
other
with-
degree.
But I'm with you, I'm not, 10% is too low.
But so I get
Yeah.
what you're saying, but I also want to be clear that what we're preserving here is actually of use. Is actually in long-term use, not today's use, but is actually has a commitment to keep that land in some form or shape that will in fact carry on the role that we're trying to preserve. That's the thing that I'm seeing, that I'm in conflict with when I look around the county. How much of that land is really being harnessed and preserved for a a good and common use in the future. And so I have something when we come to it, that's some of my serious concerns about where we sit as a county.
To your concern about enforcement, essentially, I mean, our suggestion in working with clients would be, especially, if there's things that are not spelled out in the regulations, if an applicant is coming before you and they're making a commitment or saying that they're making a commitment, condition it, bind them to that permit, something that will be reviewed, followed up on. Their hypothetical example, there was a project that we were reviewing that this is what we're developing. But all that land that we're telling you we're not developing, we may want to develop. Okay, well, then what are we actually looking at?
Yeah.
If you're saying this is what you're developing, but you want infinite variability, then what are we doing here?
Yeah.
So, we want applicants to come with as close to a baked plan as possible, that they've done the site investigation to know where they can reasonably develop and where they can't reasonably develop. And that's a lot of the application process, what they're providing to you, what you're committing them, what they're committing to, and what you're requiring of them.
Well, you also mentioned, I think, and this maybe gets to your point a little bit, it's bonding.
Yeah.
And if you think about, an erosion control plan, right, you have to bond until you stabilize the soil. Maybe there's some sort of a threshold here, maybe it's not stabilization, but maybe it's, I don't know, fill in the blank, where we feel like it's stabilized and you can release the bond, but it's longer than just soil stabilization. The last thing I'll mention too, I was thinking about is technology, right? This is an ever-changing industry. And I don't know, maybe batteries are gonna get smaller, maybe we're gonna need more of them. Maybe the percentage of imperviousness in the solar panels can be increased because you can create some kind of a honeycomb version or something, I don't know. But, I think we have to figure out if there's a way to somehow, without a crystal ball, obviously, be adaptable in our ordinance to allow for those changes.
That's great. Does the county have any specified, like, quantitative goals around renewable energy? Just to go back to Commissioner Missel's point, do we know?
Climate action plans.
The climate action plan has some information in it. I don't remember exactly what it says. But it does not have,
A number.
we should produce X amount of megawatts of solar.
Yeah.
Does it have anything regarding reduction of emissions?
Yeah.
But I thought that was about my recollection is that that's about the county organization and not about the community writ large.
It still addresses community.
I thought that the number that's on there is a county number,
I don't remember.
that the county,
That might
that
be.
the organization's gonna become carbon neutral by some date.
We do have somebody here from
Oh, you did?
that office who worked on that plan.
You can say that.
Maybe I could just speak to that briefly. Peg Daly, Climate Protection Program Manager for the county. So the targets, the emissions reduction targets are county-wide, community-wide. So certainly looking to lead by example within local government operations. But the goal or the target to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030, that's community-wide. The plan has just right now those emissions reduction targets for 2030 and 2050. Currently, staff are working to develop SMART goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, right, time-bound, for the specific sectors within the plan. So transportation, building, renewable energy. So the point you made a minute ago about, could we have goals with respect to the amount of, let's say, kilowatt hours generated? That's something that staff are currently working on, and maybe could bring back for discussion at some point.
And measuring those goals, like how are we doing, right?
Yeah.
Doing the metrics. Thank you.
Well, I'm also curious if you, in your consulting to the county, are gonna bring to us example language from comp plans, for example, because we're obviously in the process of updating our comprehensive plan, and I feel like if you read the comprehensive plan for the rural area, which as Lonnie said is most of the county, it doesn't seem like solar farms would fit in there.
Doesn't.
When you read what we're trying to promote in the rural area, I don't,
Yeah.
if I could read that and say, okay, then solar doesn't belong in the rural area.
So
You know, I know we can then go to another chapter in the comp plan, read something about energy and, you know, but I'm just saying, it's not written to facilitate that type of language.
So development of policies for the comp plan is not within the scope of our work. We're focused on the regulations, but I think the way we get to that, you know, for some of these things that don't lend themselves maybe to a regulation, they do become potential findings that you're evaluating your project by. And then potentially, you know, those make their way and inform the
But the
comp plan.
ordinance could be done. Wasn't the ordinance, the people who were working on the ordinances?
It's the Berkeley, yeah.
Isn't it them?
Isn't the
Yeah.
Berkeley?
So just pass it to them.
We're working on the zoning ordinance,
Yeah,
but
right.
not the
Right.
comprehensive.
I understand that,
Yeah.
but they're also bringing to, my understanding is that they're bringing to us sort of a revision or ideas for revisions to our ordinance.
Yes.
So,
Right.
And that's my staff.
oh, that's your staff, okay,
Yes.
well, your staff.
So- I'm here today focused on solar regulation.
Okay,
Yes, our company is also assisting with the overall zoning ordinance.
Ordinance, right,
And
okay.
at some point, these two lines,
something like that. okay.
yes.
We have three that are going on right now. We've got the comprehensive, we have this, and we have wireless.
Right,
And
okay.
it's likely that they will be happening on separate.
Oh, separate.
Yeah,
And then ultimately, the comprehensive one will pull in these smaller bites of the commercial solar and wireless.
I personally find that a bit frustrating, like, it seems, I'll just say again, it feels cart before horse in the sense that if you're, you know, the comprehensive plan should set up a series of goals and recommendations that should lead into our zoning ordinance, you know, and the fact that we're doing them in parallel means that we may get to the end of this and have the comprehensive plan that's in conflict with our zoning.
The board specifically wanted to go this route, that's why we're here.
Yeah,
I hear
because-
what you're saying, we can pass that along, just let you know.
And internally, we are working to make sure that we don't end up with the cart before the horse. This conversation about solar and what you all are saying, we can wrap that in. I mean, we're getting these notes and those thoughts are gonna be wrapped into what we do with the comp plan and update that section. So it all does work together. And I know, I wish we could have some time between the two, but between the comp plan and then the zoning ordinance, but we are doing everything we can to make sure that they do match. So.
Could I ask some definitional things before we move on? So could you just give us a quick definition on community solar? Because I think we're assuming that that I don't believe it is.
Yeah.
But could you do that for us right quick?
So there's multiple definitions. So Department of Energy will tell you that community solar is essentially more distributed, smaller scale projects
Right.
that usually they are tied to a program where essentially residents are subscribing and purchasing renewable energy credits, but not always.
Not always, But
Sometimes,
that's the leading point, right?
yeah,
there.
sometimes they are tied to they're providing energy to users behind the meter,
Mhm.
net meter,
That meter, okay.
which personally I prefer.
Yeah, of course.
You know, I think because then you're directly attributing that project to a reduction of
Or a
consumption.
household's
Correct.
consumption or an entity's consumption.
Dominion has a community solar program.
Right.
And so the DOE definition, community solar and shared solar
Mhm.
kind of go hand in hand.
Mhm.
Shared solar is more where you're directly benefiting from the generated electricity.
Mhm.
Dominion does have a community solar program, and it's a little bit of a misnomer,
Mhm.
the way they title it. And unfortunately, we have seen, not from Dominion, but from some developers in the state, where they will come in and say it's a community solar project. Your residents are benefiting from this project, because then they can be a subscriber in Dominion's program. Well, they could be a subscriber in Dominion's program regardless of whether or not you have a community solar project in your locality. And No, just because you have that community solar project in your locality, doesn't mean that they're deriving energy produced from
Any
it.
benefit there?
The only, and this is something that I've recently gained a little bit more clarity on. And this goes to the physics question. Those smaller projects can tie into a KW line versus a transmission line.
That's right.
And the way that
That's right.
things move,
Right.
yes, you're probably deriving production even though it's grid integrated.
So that for colleagues, that's something that we actually could look at for communities that are being built.
Yes, and
Because that then has that you can tie that to a direct sort of reduction of energy in a community. So for instance, again, this place up on Ryle Road, if that was something a number of us talked about, why don't you, or this, I keep messing it up, the Eco Village or Eco Village, whatever, if it ever gets built.
Oh, yeah.
If they were ever to do that, then they are in fact being self-sufficient or more so self-sufficient. And so the delineation between community and how that can actually come to our developments
Yeah.
and utility solar, which I am uncomfortable ever saying that utility solar helps the houses which are right next door. Because the energy's going up to the system and it's going wherever the demand is.
well, and part of the challenge too with Dominion's community solar program is that they have the highest the cost to participate is one of the highest ones in the nation.
That's right, and so that's our leverage.
There is one locality we work with that says no more than 8,000 acres in the county can be used for solar. Of that 8,000, 1,000 has to be reserved for community
The
solar
community,
projects.
that's good.
What percentage is 8,000 acres of that community?
I think it's 3 to 5, something around that.
So if I
I think
could,
that's Goochland County.
yeah,
Oh.
is it?
No,
No,
No, They
somewhere
have
else?
they have a percent limit.
a lot of them do. This particular one is Brunswick County.
Brunswick County. So if I could run through a couple of other things then right quickly. So I think it would be interesting to see a map that's a mile to 2 miles away from a transmission. And then say, look at the available land around that. And then sort of then between the county and some particular players in town, look to see if there are opportunities there as opposed to,
Yeah, the Department of Energy already has a model online that shows that.
okay.
All
but
you have
use-
to do is click.
But using that as a
Yeah.
benchmark, if we say,
It
let's
shows
not,
you what they say is already appropriate.
let's not overdo that, but let's say these are the areas which are in play, and then have the county sort of work, economic development work with those entities. If there is a structured way, and there's some ways to do that, for the county to benefit from being in that partnership. So that comes to how we do, because there are some ways in which the county could generate some income from that. Because the one thing that I would like to see coming from this is that if we're going to have more than the 4 here, let's say we get to a dozen, that there's some revenue to put into staff to train the EMS and the fire. There's some money to put in the staff that has an individual who can actually do monitoring. So she could do monitoring of these things, because these are not there's a complication to that. I'm personally for a bifurcated process. So I think a bifurcated process actually is helpful for the community. It is also helpful for me as a commissioner. So I would support that. I would also support, I'd like to know what happens, if anything, if someone whose property is in land use says, I want to now have, and they're within the 2-mile radius, and says, yes, I'd like to sort of lease some of my property to a solar thing, because I'm within the map. Or in addition to, what happens to someone who's in a conservation easement, and if there's some value with that, and if there is, I would like the supervisors to have a conversation about, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? Because we're letting a piece of property have a reduced tax base, and their income from that piece of property has just moved to a certain level. Well, I can't say, and people will say, I'm trying to take that away. No, I just want to make sure that the intended use of the land is in fact flows, the benefits from that flows to the owner of the land, but that the revenue from that, as far as taxes are concerned, flow back to the community. The other thing that I would like to have some conversation about is, and this comes to my colleagues here, instead of us having this sort of mono approach to rural, that we actually think about what can also be, and this is coming to Fred's idea, we don't know what tomorrow can be as far as opportunity for energy. I just read this interesting thing about if we could do it, and I don't know what the cost is at right now. If we could get to some of the hydrogen, there's a whole pool of hydrogen that's just below the crust. That is the cheapest and cleanest energy we could ever get out of there. And I have no idea what that looks like underneath Albemarle County.
Well, there are people here who have geothermal heating.
Well, I know,
Well-
but this is even different from that.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is
Yeah, it's
the
just
tech-
getting-
yeah, I know that.
Space
Yeah,
age.
yeah, get that, yes, it's getting space, but
We've dabbled into that a little bit.
have you?
In terms of researching.
Well, I'm excited about that because that would actually that could answer a number of issues which are plaguing our culture around alternative energy sources.
Yeah, I mean, generally, you don't even need to do that tapping. You can derive it from water source.
Yeah, yeah.
But.
I don't want the stuff that's already there.
Yeah,
I
well,
don't
you-
wanna have to convert it, because converting it, I need energy.
Yes.
And I'm
right,
trying,
correct.
there's a source of it that I don't need energy for, that I can actually just use it as it is. And so it's not this, I forget the determination between what's ag and what's not ag, and the whole idea of what's a prime land versus not prime land. And then they come back to the whole piece that we tend to have in another part of our lives. If we were having a new industry come to town, sort of a brick and mortar industry, there would be a great deal of interaction between economic development, people, other people, on how that comes in. I'm not sure, and I just say that because I don't know, but my sense has been when solar happens, it just happens.
Right.
And while I am a free market guy, I'm not a libertarian, but I'm a free market guy. I am a free market guy. I do think that since we have only this much land, there ought to be some kind of meaningful discussion between the economic development people and the people who are supposedly running this. We're not supposedly, I don't mean that in that derogatory way, but who have been elected to run the community. So that in fact, we are doing the cost benefit analysis of the best use for our life, since it is what it
Right,
is.
right.
You know, we can, I mean, while in my mind, I'd like to take over the city, that's never gonna happen. Well, you know, that would be the thing I'd like to do, but that boundary's never gonna be broached. So we are who we are right now. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a procedural question?
Uh-oh.
Just want to say, because we're actually running up on time, I was gonna close down after
Oh,
Commissioner
closing down.
Bivens. Is there any?
I just wanna understand, these questions up here, if we had answered them all, which you never could have done in 90 minutes, we all know that.
Yeah.
Right,
We would have been doing your job, and I know you're trying to elicit from us our opinions on various things, or get a sense of what's most important to us. But at what point do you come back to us next with
I was asking
proposals
for
for
next
these
steps,
things?
yeah.
I'm trying to understand, because we didn't answer all these things.
No, and I would tell you, if there's anything important that occurs to you, you wake up in the middle of the night and you think I need to share this, just email me. Yeah, email Bill and he'll get it to us. I believe the next step is a similar session with the Board of Supervisors.
I have to go back and look, but I believe that's correct. It's going back to them. But when we do that, we'll have some more things put together. We wanted to come here and sort of, I've been taking lots of notes about things that are important to you. They're matching up with things we've heard previously. You've filled in some things. We'll then start building on this, the board supervisors, and then ultimately develop an ordinance and come back and have a public hearing to put this body in.
But I assume, I just want to ask this, because I know this didn't necessarily happen with one of our comp plan sessions. You're going to give the Board of Supervisors whatever came out of this discussion before they have their discussion.
Oh, we would have to, yes, whenever we come to the planning commission and have something like this, we package it up and make sure the board has it.
Yeah, and we'll synthesize what I heard, what we heard, and make sure that we're on the same page, that Bill agrees that we heard the same thing. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for the presentation, it was very informative.
Memo was excellent.
Okay,
Yes,
I'll share that.
thank you for the discussion. With that, we'll adjourn the meeting. I know we have to get over for 6 o'clock soon, so.
Oh,
You have 29 minutes to eat.
we get to eat.
More